Hello, does classical conditioning confuse you? I know some of you in class, my level 200 students for University of Education, Winneba, some of you were a bit confused the last time it was taught. And so this morning, I'm explaining it to you. So we are going to look at the definition, how it came about, the terminologies, the principles, the applications, including classroom applications. So let's set the ball. So classical conditioning was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, 1849 to 1936. He was a physiologist, not a psychologist, and he stumbled upon this significant scientific discovery while researching salivation in dogs during the 1890s. Initially, he was investigating dog salivation response to being fed. So he inserted small test tubes into their cheeks to measure saliva when they were fed with meat powder. So here we see a dog with saliva being collected. And Pavlov's expectation was that the dogs would salivate only in response to the presented food. However, he observed an unexpected phenomenon during this experiment. The dogs began salivating not only at the sight of food, but also at the sound of the lab assistant's footsteps, who brought them the food. Intrigued by this, Pavlov delved deeper into this peculiar behavior through further experiments. So Pavlov made a crucial realization. The dogs had learned to associate the lab assistant and other objects or events consistently paired with food with the act of being fed. So as a result, these associated stimuli trigger salivary responses in the dogs, even when food was not directly presented. And so Pavlov termed this form of learning classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. Fascinated by the process of stimulus-response associations, he dedicated the rest of his career to studying this phenomenon. His groundbreaking research revolutionized psychology, laying the foundation for understanding how organisms, including humans, learn to associate events and adapt their behavior accordingly. So classical conditioning became a fundamental concept in behavioral psychology, influencing subsequent generations of psychologists and advancing the understanding of learning and conditioning. So classical conditioning can be defined as learning that occurs when a previously neutral stimulus is paired or associated with an unconditioned stimulus to elicit a conditioned response. So classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian or respondent conditioning, is learning through association. So in simple terms, two stimuli are linked together to produce a new learned response in a person or an animal. So Pavlov's work in 1902 was rooted in the concept that certain behaviors in dogs are innate and do not require learning. For instance, dogs naturally salivate whenever they see food, which is a reflex built into their biology. And so in behaviorist terms, the presentation of food is known as an unconditioned stimulus, while the salivation triggered by the sight of food is considered an unconditioned response. So these reflexive connections between a stimulus and a response are hardwired and do not involve any form of learning, according to Pavlov. So let's look at the key terminologies. I've already mentioned them, but then let's still look at the neutral stimulus. That is before conditioning or before learning. It does not naturally elicit a response of interest. So for example, we have in the picture, we see a tuning fork that makes a sound. This tuning fork, the sound of the tuning fork will not elicit any response of salivation or even excitement in the dog. Then the unconditioned stimulus is elicits the unconditioned response without prior conditioning or learning. So meat powder will naturally elicit salivation in the dog. And then we have the unconditioned response. That's the unlearned reaction to the unconditioned stimulus occurring without prior learning. So the unconditioned stimulus is the meat powder, and then the unconditioned response is salivation. Then we have conditioned stimulus. This is a previously neutral stimulus that through repeated associations or pairing with the unconditioned stimulus now causes a conditioned response. So you see, the dog had learned an association between the bell and the food. And so a new behavior had been learned. And because this response was learned or conditioned, it is called a conditioned response, and also known as Pavlovian response. So the neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus. Why? Because it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus. And therefore, the neutral stimulus alone has the capacity to evoke a response that is similar to the unconditioned response, but now it is called a conditioned response. So here we have 4 diagrams in the quadrants. So again, to go over it, we have the unconditioned stimulus here. You have the unconditioned stimulus, which evokes salivation. We see saliva coming out of the dog, which is the unconditioned response. Then we have a neutral stimulus, that is the bell. When it is rung, it does not elicit any form of response from this dog. So you see there's no response. But then during conditioning, when the bell is rung and then the food or the meat is presented, so the bell, that's the neutral stimulus, and then the meat, which is the unconditioned stimulus, they are associated with each other repeatedly. The dog salivates as if it is salivating only to the food. And so now, after conditioning, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, which elicits a conditioned response, that is salivation. So we will look at quite a number of examples, because I've given a number of examples so that it will be easier for you to understand classical conditioning. So now let's look at your almighty food, the food that you enjoy eating on campus, gobe. That is gari, beans or cowpea, and fried plantain, and the egg. So let's say last week you ate gobe. Later that day, you came down with an abdominal ache from contamination from bacteria in the food. So now when you eat gobe, you have abdominal ache. Maybe you may even have diarrhea. So which is the unconditioned stimulus? The unconditioned stimulus is the bacterial contamination. It's possible the beans was not warmed or heated before being served, and maybe was a beans from a previous day, and therefore it may have been contaminated by bacteria. And once bacteria gets into your stomach, definitely you are going to have a stomach ache or diarrhea or some nausea or vomiting. So the bacterial contamination is the unconditioned stimulus. And then the neutral stimulus is the gobe that you always enjoy. And then the neutral stimulus, which is associated with the unconditioned stimulus. So the neutral stimulus, that is the gobe, associated with the bacterial contamination, leads to an unconditioned response, that is the abdominal ache. And so the conditioned stimulus, that's gobe, soon becomes a conditioned response, or it soon elicits or provokes a conditioned response, that's abdominal ache. And therefore, anytime you eat gobe, it leads to abdominal ache. Now let's look at another one that will make it a bit easier for you to understand. Let's say you buy a new puppy or a dog and you want to name it. So in the beginning, you mention the name. Maybe you want to give the name, and you want to give it Rocky as its name. And when you mention Rocky in front of the dog, I don't think the dog is going to respond to you because that is not its name. And therefore, there'll be no response. So how do you name this dog? So what do? You then place maybe fish or food, which is the unconditioned stimulus that naturally elicits a response from the dog. That is salivation. That's the unconditioned response. Then you say Rocky. So when you say Rocky, and then after that, you present the food to the dog. After repeated pairings of the sound Rocky or the name Rocky and the food a number of times, eventually the name Rocky alone will cause your dog to salivate or your dog to come to you running and jumping. So in this case, the name Rocky had become a conditioned stimulus, causing the conditioned response of salivation or being excited to see you wagging its tail. Another one, here we have some celebrities in Ghana. We have Shatawale and Stoneboy and the other person, Zikinata. So here, let's say they are advertising various brands of phones in Ghana. So the neutral stimulus is the phone, and the unconditioned stimulus is the celebrity because you're happy to see them, happy to hear the songs that they sing or the rap music that they always give out. And therefore, I mean, these celebrities alone, the thought about them, seeing them alone makes you excited. And so the unconditioned response would be positive feelings or perceptions associated with the celebrities, whether Stoneboy, Kenata, or Satawale. So the conditioned stimulus now becomes the celebrity endorsed products or the phone. So the conditioned response is the positive feelings or perceptions transferred from the celebrity to the product, leading to an increased interest or purchase of the product. So you see how advertisers use classical conditioning to get us to buy their product. The product itself is a neutral stimulus. It does not necessarily evoke any response, but the moment they pair it with a celebrity or somebody that you like, the feelings that you have, the excitement that you have about that celebrity is transferred to the product because the product has been associated with the celebrity. And therefore, the product now becomes a conditioned stimulus, which evokes a conditioned response. Let's look at another example. Let's say classical conditioning with your smartphone ringtones. I know some of you have a special ringing tone for some of your friends or your family members or even your girlfriend or your boyfriend. So initially, the smartphone ringing tone is a neutral stimulus. It does not trigger any specific emotional response or behavior when it rings. So when the specific person cause you the unconditioned stimulus, the person that makes you excited, let's say your boyfriend or your girlfriend, I mean, the thought of him or her alone sends butterflies in your stomach, it makes you very excited. So when this person calls you, you naturally feel emotions or have thoughts related to your relationship with that person or the importance of their call. So this response is the unconditioned response. The good emotions, the feel-good emotions is what we call the unconditioned response. So through the repeated pairings of the smartphone ringing tone with calls from that specific person, you start to associate the ringing tone with the emotions or thoughts brought about by the person's call. So the ringing tone is still the neutral stimulus and the person's call is the unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, this smartphone ringing tone, now the conditioned stimulus alone, can trigger the emotions or thoughts you initially had only in response to the specific person's call. So now the smartphone ringing tone becomes the conditioned stimulus, and then the emotions that it triggers becomes the conditioned response. I hope with all these examples, you now understand how classical conditioning takes place in our everyday lives. Now let's look at the principles of classical conditioning. The first principle is acquisition. This is the initial learning phase in classical conditioning, where an organism forms an association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So during this stage, the neutral stimulus starts to elicit a conditioned response. We have already explained it with the ringing tone, with the celebrity endorsement of products, and the eating of gobe and having a stomach ache. We've explained it all together. Then the next one is extinction. extinction. So extinction is a psychological process in classical conditioning where the conditioned response gradually weakens or diminishes. And this occurs when the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is repeatedly broken, leading to a decrease in the conditioned response. For example, Pavlov's dog was repeatedly exposed to the bell. That's a conditioned stimulus without being presented with food, the unconditioned stimulus. So soon the dog gradually stops salivating in response to the bell. So let's say you've named your dog Rocky, and Rocky always responds to your responds to the name Rocky, and it keeps coming to you. And then whenever it comes, you don't give it any food. Soon, when you mention Rocky, I'm sure Rocky will just look at you and eye you. I will not even come to you, will not even wag its tail, because you're not giving it food any longer. Then the next is spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is a phenomenon in classical conditioning where after a period of time has elapsed since extinction, the conditioned response re-emerges in a weaker form when the conditioned stimulus is presented again. So again, after Pavlov allowed some time to pass following extinction, he rang the bell again, and the dog showed a slight return of salivation in response to the sound. So let's say with your dog, after extension has taken place, when you call, you mention Rocky, because you are not giving food, and Rocky will not come to you, it will not look excited, it will not salivate. After some time, you give it a couple of days, when you say Rocky, there will be what we call spontaneous recovery. Rocky will respond to you. But then if after that you are still not giving it food, then forget it. Rocky will no longer, the dog will no longer respond to the sound Rocky. Then generalization. Generalization is the tendency for an organism to respond to a similar way to stimuli that are similar but not identical to the conditioned stimulus. So this occurs when conditioned response is evoked by stimuli resembling the original conditioned stimulus. Example, in Pavlov's experiment, if a dog is conditioned to salivate in response to the sound of a specific bell, it may also salivate to a similar higher pitched bell. Again, let's say if you are bitten by a dog, so you become afraid of all dogs, whether they are Alsatian dogs or local breeds, whether it's a puppy or a big dog or a medium-sized dog, you become afraid of all dogs because a dog has bitten you. In the Ghanaian, one of the Ghanaian proverbs or idioms, we say a person who has been bitten by a snake is even afraid of worms. So you see, that is generalization of the stimulus. Now, discrimination. Discrimination is a process in classical conditioning where the organism learns to differentiate between similar stimuli and respond differently to each one. It involves distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant stimuli. So the dog is able to discriminate between different sounds. For example, you know the sound of your ringing tone when it's a call, and the sound when it's a mumu alert. When you're expecting an alert, it has a different sound, and it has a different sound for a text message and a different mumu alert sound. So you're able to discriminate. Example, in the same way too, students are able to discriminate between two teachers who teach them. For example, in the university, you have several lecturers teaching you. But there are some lecturers, they are very strict with you. If you are late to their class, they will sack you. And therefore, you know that for this particular lecturer, you dare not be late to their class. But for other lecturers, so they cannot even be bothered. You can come to class at even 10 minutes to the end of the lecture, and they still will not say anything. And so students are able to discriminate between these two lecturers and know how to act accordingly. So now, what are the educational implications of classical conditioning. You see, when student forms negative emotional associations with school, with the adverse consequences, including the development of school phobia. Let's say if the student experiences bullying at school, they may start associating the school environment with fear and anxiety because bullying evokes fear. Bullying is an unconditioned stimulus, which elicits an unconditioned response, that is anxiety or fear. And then the school environment is the neutral stimulus. But then if bullying, which is the unconditioned stimulus, is always happening in the school environment, it will elicit an unconditioned response, that is fear. Soon, the school environment alone, soon when a child is going to school, the child starts panicking and they don't want to go to school because of the fear associated with being in school. And then if you're a parent and your child feels reluctant to go to school, be patient with the child and find out from the child what is happening in school and let the child tell you and then try and address it. Similarly, certain students may display a persistent dislike for particular subjects throughout the academic journey. And this aversion could be a result of negative experience such as humiliation or punishment by teachers in the classroom. And a typical example within the Ghanaian system is the learning of French and the learning of mathematics. I mean, the teacher's attitude, which is an unconditioned stimulus, leads to an unconditioned response, that is fear or anxiety. And then the subject matter, that is mathematics or French, is a neutral stimulus. But because the teacher whose behavior elicits fear is the one teaching mathematics, soon mathematics alone leads to fear. Mathematics alone elicits fear. And if you don't take care, generalization takes place where you generalize the fear of mathematics to subjects, any subject that has mathematics, for example, accounting and physics. And so soon you don't want to have anything to do with mathematics. So in such cases, these negative emotional experiences can significantly impact a student's attitude towards school and learning, potentially affecting their academic performance and overall well-being. And it highlights the importance of creating a positive, supportive learning environment to foster healthy emotional associations with education. So learners, we've been looking at classical conditioning or Pavlovian or respondent conditioning. We looked at the definitions, we look at the terminologies, and then we look at the principles and then the applications. I hope that by this, my level 200 students in UW, you will be able to understand classical conditioning. If you do, you can comment, you can like and share it to your other colleagues in other departments in the university. Thank you for watching and see you in class tomorrow.